Say this, one of the things you often hear people say is that's just talk. And our talk doesn't mean much. What I want to do with you today is to defend talk, particularly as fluency, and to defend the notion that language is pretty central to life. And I think it's very central to justice. So I'm going to be defending talk. I won't defend talking but not walking the talk. We'll talk about walking the talk next time, but tonight at least fluency is what I call it. I start that chapter with something that happened to me when I was 14 years old. I was out for the high school football team and noticed that I was having these terrible pains down my back. It got so bad I got in bed one day and couldn't get up. It just locked up on me. So my mom and dad sent me to the bone doctor. And I never will forget that before I went, I was lying in that bed. And I was thinking to myself, man, you got an incurable disease. You're going to be paralyzed. You're going to die. I mean, that's the way I was thinking as a 14-year-old. So I go to the bone doctor, the orthopedist, and he tells me I've got spondylolisthesis. I didn't learn to say that for several years, as I recall. It means that one of your vertebrae sits forward, maybe more than one, but sits forward. Mine sat forward about 3/8 of an inch, still does. The orthopedist told me I needed to come back to him that summer and have surgery that I didn't want to do. He said if I didn't have it, I'd step off a curb one day and I would be paralyzed the rest of my life. He told me that meanwhile, I need to wear a back brace until I could come and have the surgery. So I said to him, well, can I play football after the surgery? He said, oh, no. You'll be basically an invalid the rest of your life. He said, I suppose you could play golf. When I found out he was a golfer, that made me question maybe his assessment at that point. Anyhow, I never went back for the surgery. I'm so glad I didn't. I started going to a chiropractor and he gave me adjustments and told me about my sciatic nerve, which was pinched, and told me with adjustments and other things, I could live a normal life. He too told me I should not play football, but I needed to do regular visits, which I did for a year. Later on, I found out that basically what caused those spasms was when I would do a lot of running. Later, when I pitched, I'd do a lot of 40-40s, run 40 yards, walk 40 yards and do that. So you do 40 of those things every day to get your legs built up. Well, that would tighten hamstrings, yank my back further out of whack. And I'd get a spasm and I'd be put in bed again. I finally learned what I really needed to do was stretch and keep my gut relatively flat. And that solved most of my back problems. If I did all that today, I bend over and touch the floor. And if I do that regularly, I have little to no back trouble at all. What I want you to notice in that, and you should have the outline there, notice how the language shifted for me. From my initial concept of disease and paralysis and death to the language of the orthopedist and then the chiropractor, and then later my own. What I want to suggest is that practices do tend to be connected to, that language tends to be connected to practice. And I'm convinced that if you change somebody's language, you will often change their experience and change their practices. I'm not sure we have language without practice. Now, maybe some of you can come up with it. Let me say what I mean there. When I say we don't have practices without language, I include in language representative language. That would be where you describe fairly accurately, the kind of experience you're having. But we also have expressive language. For example, one of the things that they pressed me to do when I was in a lot of back pain was to say something besides, oh, dear God, that hurts. That's expressive language. They wanted me to describe my language. And when I say practices have language, I include both representative, where I'm trying to describe it, but also expressive language as well, or non-representative language. Is that, you understand that? Have I said that clearly enough?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Remember too that language itself is a practice. It is a practice, and it's very important. Some people call humans the language animals, but that's being called into question by people who are now saying, well, a lot of other animals also have language, at least signs and things that convey meaning. I think that's probably true. Stan Hauerwas is an important ethicist, theologian in this country, and he says something that I would caution you about. I think he's correct. We don't transcend language in order to examine it. That is, when you start trying to understand language, you use language to do so. All right. So we can't get away from it, I think. Look at word, concept, and experience. And I will get, I promise, to the point where we talk about what this has to do with justice, okay? Experience. We sometimes don't understand how much our words, our concepts, our beliefs actually shape our experience. As I said, I think if you change your language, you change your experience. Let me go back for a moment. If I had used the language when I first began to have back trouble, I don't know that I would have ever changed my behavior. But by the time I got to where I was developing language of stretching and getting that sciatic nerve and those muscles pulled out so I could, work with them, that new language really changed my life. In fact, I now have gone, I think, 40 years with very minimal back pain. Part of that is, of course, the practices, the exercises, but a major part of it is also the changing of my language about it, and therefore what I would do about it. Notice too that experience is vocabulary dependent. I once met a young woman, she was a student, and she told me that she had had chronic pain all her life. Early on, she didn't know that. Later, when they did a diagnosis, they told her that she had chronic pain and began to talk about it sufficiently that she was able to say, oh, that's what that is. Now, obviously, her pain was not just utterly devastating and excruciating, but she did have continual pain. And it was when she got language for what was going on that she was able to identify it for herself. So experience is vocabulary dependent. And Kenneth Bailey, who's a fine researcher, Middle Eastern expert, he makes the point that that there is no word in Arabic for sarcasm. So sarcasm, he says, does not exist in that culture. In fact, he contends that he spent hours talking with Arabic people trying to describe what sarcasm is. And he says, without luck, okay? So this close, important relationship significance between language and experience, crucial. When we dismiss talk, I love to quote James Edwards. He says, language is not a medium for our lives and practices. Rather, it's the stuff of human life itself, the thread out of which all our patterns of thought and action are woven. So when we accuse people of not walking the talk, maybe we need to examine the practices in which such talk is embedded. In other words, I find it less helpful to tell people you're not walking the talk than it is to find out what practice their talk actually involves. For example, I'm convinced that a lot of people who talk about justice but don't do anything are embedded in talk as a form of status politics, meaning by that you get standing, you get status, you get esteem by having the right point of view, but you may not do a damn thing. It's that kind of thing. So it's not that the talk is going on without a walk. It's just important to identify what the walk is. I'm trying to suggest that I think talk does have behavioral implications. So the question is not whether somebody's failing to walk the talk. The question is what practice is that talk engaged in? Am I being clear with that? You understand what I'm trying to say? I find it very helpful just to be able to raise questions with somebody in those terms in order to extend the conversation. I mean, if you just attack somebody and say you don't walk the talk, I don't know where you go with that. But trying to identify practices associated with, well, how do you do that talk? Et cetera. Vocabularies in religion, that's a big deal. A couple of guys, Greenway and Weatherby, they point out in a journal called Theological Education, multiple and different vocabularies we use when talking about religion, spirituality, et cetera. And they would argue, I think they're correct, there are no objective or neutral vocabularies. That a vocabulary comes out of a form of life, and the particular expressions of that language are shaped by that form of life. I remember when I started going to college, I was introduced into some very different kinds of talk language. I remember one guy at LSU where I went my first year, he loved the word pseudo, and he used pseudo all the time. Pseudo intellectuals, pseudo students, pseudo Christians. Well, he used it so much, I finally went to the dorm and looked it up in the dictionary, and it meant false. And I remember wondering, why didn't he just say false or phony? Why pseudo? But we were learning a new kind of language. I do think there's value in the word pseudo, but there is no objective or neutral vocabulary, I would contend. That vocabularies come out of a form of life, and the particular expressions of that language are shaped by that form of life. I remember for 3 seasons, I played catcher for an all-black team, except for me. They couldn't find a black guy dumb enough to catch, and I couldn't run fast enough to play anywhere else. But I'd been playing ball, I think, 35 years by the time I joined that team. And I heard something playing with them I had never heard. When a guy would make a good play, the other players would shout, "Hey, I see you, man. I see you." Well, I was sitting there back behind the plate and saying to myself, well, of course you see them. If you couldn't see, you wouldn't be playing softball. What's going on there, And then the longer I thought about it, I said, well, black guys been making the plays as long as the game's been around. The question was, did anybody else ever see it? So I see you see, became very important. Another place that is really interesting to me, and I've said this to the Trinity people, I think more than once, so they may get tired of hearing it. Talal Assad is one of my favorite anthropologists. He's the son of a traditional Muslim mother and a secular Jewish father, although his father did become later a Muslim, but again, took more of an academic intellectual interest in the faith than the mom. Talal Assad has studied the literature, the discourse, they call it, of the rise of the nation state. All right, we're talking 16th, 17th, 18th century, along through there. And what Assad says is that the word religion did not exist during that time, and that it was invented. The word religious existed, but that stood for somebody in a religious order. Okay, so when the word religion began to be used, he said that some interesting things began to happen. First of all, religion as a concept became a universal essence, okay? It was a universal essence that had a lot of particularities behind it. And then he says this, in this discourse, religion is seen as the genus, and then various traditions are understood as species of this universal essence. And then he says, what is the nature of this universal religion? He finds that it has to do with beliefs, that it is subjective, that it is a peripheral thing. It's out at the edge of your life, not at the center, at the heart of it. That it's a private matter, that it's an individual matter, and that it's a matter of choice. What I find so interesting is that's exactly how a great many Americans today would define their own religion. It's what I believe. It's my view, my subjective view. A lot of people would say, yeah, it's something I can go to. It's when I need it. It's always there out at the edge of my life. It's a private matter. It's nobody else's business but mine. And it's what I think as an individual. And it's a matter of personal choice. You ever hear that in a local church? What I'm trying to suggest here is that the discourse of the nation state, especially in the way it defined religion as a universal essence with these characteristics, has had a powerful influence on the way people in churches and synagogues and so on understand faith itself. I think that's exactly right. Here's the reference to where you can read about that in Assad. The question I have is, note how well these kinds of views of religion and spirituality fit within a consumerist and rapacious capitalism and the discourse of the nation state. What this does is move religion to the edge of life, and these other things take over the center. All right. I would suggest that this understanding of religion is rather dominant in our own time and operates as normalcy for a great many people. And I remind you of our talk about Foucault here, was that last week or the week before, where we talked about how captivity often takes place, or domination takes place as normalcy. It's what just goes on. All right. So if you remember our first session when I was talking about the theology of the Apostle Paul, his teaching about the rule of God and righteousness and justice and so forth, how much it flies in the face of this kind of language coming out of the discourse of the nation state. Let me stop there for a minute and just make sure I'm saying that clearly enough and seeing if you've got a comment or a question about it. Does that make sense? Am I communicating?
I have to get my microphone on here. That takes a while. It's
Okay.
I have to reach way over there to get the microphone. Yeah, you're not mentioning anything about white or black or any in-betweens, but this description of normal sounds like white America. And particularly, especially white evangelicalism. So and certainly a dominant cultural standard with that underlayment of the white church.
Let me say one thing. I saw some research the other day. If you need it, I can get the resource or the source. But we've now got a lot of conservative Republicans who describe themselves as evangelicals, though they don't go to church, have not gone to church. It's just that evangelical has now been connected with conservative Republican.
Yeah.
The only thing I'd say about that is that I run into an awful lot of left-wing folk who would describe religion in the same way. So I think it's more American than only the right wing.
Well, it's a dominant culture.
Yeah, yes.
And that's a white culture.
Yeah, yeah. But, you know, I hang out with the Black Baptist Ministers Association here in Kansas City, and I often hear them complaining about what's happening in the Black community in terms of how people are taking the faith in these kinds of directions as well. So
it's you feel it is the same in the Black church?
Same might not be the right word, but they have similar issues. Yeah. It may take
with faith being subjective, peripheral, private, individual.
You've got a lot of Black people do, and that's why a lot of them aren't going to church anymore.
Because
that's the first time I've heard that.
Let me back up a step, if I may.
Yeah.
You used a phrase that I don't think was in your book, but speaks powerfully to me. One's religion moves to the edge of life.
Yeah.
What you have described here to me says that what we everyday citizens have accepted is a trade-off. That rapacious capitalism, it's okay to be Amazon and Google and stuff like that. We'll whine about it, but we accept it. That's one dimension of it. The other dimension is consumerism.
Yeah.
And you know how much car stuff I got, so I've been caught up in it just like a lot of other folks. And then religion, by being private, I moved it over to the edge of my life. It's not a driving principal part of my life. That's a three-part accommodation to me that that all the language supports.
And understand the kind of power this gives to the nation state.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
We give up already.
Yeah. And that's intrinsic to the discourse. It was, you know, you're having there's some if you've not ever read it, I'd urge you to go back and look at some of the critique of the religious wars. A lot of people believe that the nation state rose historically because of religious wars and somebody had to control the situation. If you read some of the careful history, what you'll discover is that the nation state used religion as a reason for building its own basis and for the kind of peripheralization we're talking about here. I can point you to some fine historical treatments of that. I don't mean to suggest by that no person of religious faith ever, you know, weaponized the faith and killed other people. That certainly happened. But when you begin to look at the religious wars, particularly, what those wars primarily were about the rise of the nation state. I can give you some really good, Assad makes that claim, as does Michael, I'm having trouble with names, but a young, that means he's 50, Catholic theologian who's done a very nice piece on it. I'll get that name. It'll come to me as we talk tonight. But there are any number of sources I can direct you to if you're interested.
Tex, I have a question.
Yes, Dallas.
I'm going to go back a little bit. If somebody who's from the Middle East Arabic language comes to the United States or Europe or wherever and becomes fluent in English, does that change? Are they able to recognize sarcasm then?
I would say if they develop a concept for it and begin to experience the behavior, the conduct, yeah. So I think clearly so. It might be very strange to them initially.
Right. My other question is, what did Jews for 2,000 years, what did they call themselves? Did they see themselves, you would say they did not see themselves as a religion. What would they see themselves as?
Oh, I think they would have a particular Judaism. You know, I'm a Jew. Judaism, yeah. The notion of Judaism as a religion would have come very, very late with the emergence of the nation state. Muslims do not like to be included as religions.
Huh.
Yeah.
What are they?
Quite frankly, I don't like to call Christianity a religion. They're a faith tradition. Muslims, they're Muslim. They worship the one God, Allah. And when somebody starts putting them in the others' categories, you're going to find a faithful, I want to say a good, faithful Muslim resisting that. Because see, when you put somebody in a category, that is so often an act of control.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. Keep on with that. I mean, you don't have to make up your mind tonight, but just keep thinking about it. Let's go to fluency for a minute. Fluency is defined by Assad as apt utterance and behavior. He argues in his book, Genealogies of Religion, that's what the GR is. He says, we operate in a field of categories, and we have the capacity to work with language in a form of life. Let me tell you a story about my mother. Talking about a form of life and use of language. My mother was a very smart person. I came to understand that more and more the longer I was alive. I wish I'd have known it more clearly when I was a teenager. She was powerfully articulate. Boy, you mess with one of us kids inappropriately, you do something bad to her family. My mother could peel bark off a stainless steel tree. I mean, I've heard her do it. She was wonderfully articulate. You get her in a room full of college people, and she became virtually mute. Virtually mute. It was a form of life in which she finished the 10th grade, but it's a form of life she never entered. She had very few relationships with people who had education, and she was just so intimidated. I thought she'd handled herself very well if she'd have gone along with her own vernacular and just handled it the way she does, but nevertheless, she was in a form of life in which she could use language very well, but put her in another setting where a radically different form of life was at play, and it was very difficult for her. So think about the use of language as a capacity, I'm sure you do, and a capacity in a form of life. Very important there are the relationships of words to each other. I've known people in the oil field, if you got them in a situation where they couldn't cuss, I mean, it took away half their language, that kind of a thing. But also here too, that the capacity to work in a language has a certain kind of a musicality to it. I've heard people in the oil field who could cuss, and I promise you, it was an extraordinary performance. They knew how to cuss. Now, there are people who cuss and they say the F word all the time. They don't know how to cuss. And they just kind of disgust me because they're such poor performatives of that kind of language. But there's a certain musicality. And I love the old Mark Twain story. Twain cut himself shaving and he cursed a blue streak. So his wife came over and repeated every word. That should be word, not work. Sorry about that. I dictate these things and it doesn't always get it. But she repeated every word he said. And Harold Beck, who tells this story, said Twain was enough of a 19th century chauvinist to be taken aback. But then he smiled and he said to her, "My dear, you've got all the words right, but you don't know the tune. You don't know the tune." So she didn't have that kind of musicality. But you can have a musicality in language, other than cussing, of course. Henry Matthews, look here, the three complexities of fluency. One is the relationship of language to the sensibilities of a people. Henry Matthews is an American. He's a writer. He's a very good writer, apparently. And he talks about the sensible infrastructure of speech. For example, he's fluent in French, but he refuses to write in French because he says, yes, I'm fluent. I can carry on conversation with anyone, but I don't have that sensible infrastructure of high schools in France. And he feels you've got to have that kind of relationship to a language in order to be truly fluent, okay? Also in language, you can have the same word phrase, but it can be used so many different ways. So that to know how a word or a phrase is used, you got to pay attention to the setting, the tone of voice, the inflections, the gestures, the knowing glances, and the rest. I have a sister who's the brightest sibling in the family. And she uses a phrase all the time. If somebody is sick and in the hospital, she'll say, bless her heart. If somebody has really had a hard time in business or something, she'll, oh, bless her heart. At the same time, if somebody is just a bit overbearing and inappropriate and out of sorts, she'll say, bless her heart. And you know good and well, she's saying, go to hell. Understand? Here are the subtleties of the use of language, of which my sister is quite capable. So a third thing is what's called deep grammar. Now, deep grammar, what I'm trying to get at there, it's not my language. I'll have a source here in a minute. What I'm trying to get at is the way that certain semantic meaningful terms, the way certain meaningful terms in a language of a people or a person, and they're ordinary, that should be syntactical, syntax. You remember that? The structure, how you use words, how you put words together, so that in a language in their ordinary syntactical relationships, that is, the key words, concepts, and beliefs and use in the vocabulary of a given group. Do you know anybody that you can almost be assured they're going to use a word in a conversation with you? You've heard it from them so many times. Or do you know somebody when they get down to something that's really important to them, there's some words that are going to crop up, Are there ways of saying things that are just so typical of that person that if you were doing some kind of a roast of them, you would be sure and say those words and the crowd that knew them well would laugh. You know what I'm talking about? That's what I'm saying in terms of, that's what's being said here in terms of a deep grammar and how that operates and so forth. So that the common or conventional relationships, that is, deep grammar has to do with the common or conventional relationships of these words, concepts, and beliefs to each other. And syntax, that's the word I was trying to use up here under syntactical. Okay, syntax, that's the set of rules, principles, and processes that determine the structure of words and sentences in a language. Let me give you an example. If I said, I stuck a nap today, would that strike you as weird?
Yes.
Would any of you want to say, no, you mean you took a nap? No, I stuck a nap. All right. Now, I'm obviously using a phrase that's not used, I dare say, in the forms of life in which most of us live. Is that right? Is that true?
Yeah.
And so syntax has to do with a set of rules, principles. I could say it another way. I could say it this way. I stuck a nap between lunch and a 3 o'clock appointment today. That works better, doesn't it? Still maybe not good, but it works better because I've used I've used some kind of a rule to describe I stuck a nap between, talking about putting it between noon and 3 o'clock. That gives more syntactical meaning to what I meant by stuck. Okay. So that Note that these rules are usually only implicitly understood, articulated by the great majority of people who use them all the time. But we know, don't we, when someone just doesn't sound right. All right. I'm always I always pay attention to that word in John, you know, where it says the word became flesh and lived, skanu, pitched tent among us. That word really in scripture means the act of God. The act of God became flesh and lived, pitched tent among us. So that there's a real sense, I want to say, that words have an infleshed living among us. And that fluency involves living with the language of a people and joining their linguistic practices in all their musicality, sensibilities, nuanced usage, and deep grammar. I spent the last 2 days in Arkansas talking with a group of United Methodist clergy about cultural traditionalists. And one of the things I was trying to do there was to work with the whole issue of language and how you use language and how you work with cultural traditionalists who place a great deal of emphasis on family rhetoric is very important. I know family is important to a lot of us, but if you're going to engage in persuasion, you better be talking a social issue in terms of what happens to their families. You know, territory is so important, where they live or where they lived at one time. It could be an urban neighborhood. It could be a small town. It could be a rural, you know, farming area. The part of my hometown that was there when I was growing up, I can tell you a story, maybe more than one, that occurred on every street in my hometown. When I drive through my hometown, those stories jut up to me again and again because you know, place was so important in my life, and of course in the kind of oral culture in which I was raised, story was so important as well. The negative part about language is that it's also basic to captivity, to systems of domination, and it requires critique, challenge, replacement. Gary Wills has a wonderful discussion of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. And one of the things he says is that the way this country understood itself before Lincoln's address was one in which certain people ruled. Property ruled. By the way, we're returning to that now in some dangerous ways, but hang on a minute. He says that once Lincoln made that address, it changed the way that Americans thought about this country. Now, maybe he's overstating it, or maybe you need to go and listen to the way in which he states that in a more careful way. But I thought he made a pretty good point. And he says that when Lincoln begins to talk about government of the people, by the people, for the people, he has changed the way that the nation was understood. I'm so concerned about the Supreme Court right now that I'm afraid we're going in the opposite direction, but nevertheless, okay. What's the so what of this? Let me get through this so I can turn this to you. One of the things we desperately need to do, I think, in terms of justice work, in terms of the common good, in terms of the Christian faith, I think we need to address the dearth of language for the communication of faith and spirituality. If Assad is correct that we've reduced religion in terms of those categories of the nation state to the subjective, peripheral, etc., then I think that speaks powerfully to the need for us to regain a language. Wade Clark Roof, in an important study of baby boomers, now this is 20 years ago, but he said boomers do not have a clear and compelling vocabulary of faith. And I would say an awful lot of boomer talk participates in the language I was describing as coming from the discourse of the nation state. Now you say, well, now wait a minute, that's research that's 30 years old. Look at Christian Smith. He's been doing a longitudinal study of young adults. This was published in 2011. There'll be another one coming out soon, I hope. But he found that young adults then, these are basically millennials, are consumed. This is a national study. Okay, he's been following these folks since high school. So, I mean, it's high quality stuff. One of our best sociologists, I would argue. He says that they are consumed with consumerism. This is conclusion. Their basic problem is the way in which ideology and practice of mass consumerism has constituted their identity and their visions of themselves.
Yeah.
They are not active citizens, but inquisitive consumers. They need a new vocabulary. That's a pretty powerful conclusion. Look at Ann Taves for just a minute. She did an unpublished paper. This was part of Roof's book that he reports, but I think it's so helpful because she was talking to people who are ecumenically inclined, interreligiously inclined, you know, who really want to work with people of other faiths as well as in their own. And she said, you know, we really need a vocabulary. She said, we don't have ways of talking about competing and conflicting and contradictory claims in the way we talk about our faith traditions. She said, we need tradition. Tradition. Let me say this. A lot of people say, oh, God, let's just reject tradition. The more I read the church, they call them fathers, they are men, the church fathers, particularly the Cappadocian fathers, you know, St. Gregory of Nyssa. Oh, dear God, the richness of that, you know, the depth of that tradition, its coherence, the way in which they're coming out of a radically different cultural context at a radically different time. And yet how well, you know, recognizing that you can still so appreciate what they have to say. I think they're, for example, St. Gregory about Nyssa about the Trinity. It's just knock dead wonderful. That doesn't mean you don't criticize. Of course you do. That's what theology is. It's ongoing criticism, you know. But so important. She said, we've got to have an ecumenical sensibility. You know, dear God, I'm a Christian. I believe that Jesus Christ is a revelation of God. That doesn't mean I want to throw Jews out for crying out loud. God, I was just with Rabbi Zedek last week in a class he taught. I love the man. I know God loves him. And Rabbi Zedek knows something about God that we Christians don't know. And God's going to bless that. God's not going to send him to hell. Okay. So where is that? And I know that's interfaith sensibility, but still the importance of Jews, the importance of Muslims. And we got some crazy, violent Muslims. Of course, we ain't got any crazy, violent Christians, do we? You know, so interfaith appreciation is so important. We need institutional renewal, reform. We need corporate belief, practice. And we need to keep a healthy tension. That means keep them together. A contemplative, meditative life of prayer. That's what Ann Taves is saying. That's some of her suggestion about where we need to be going. Now, so the first thing we need to address the dearth of language that we've got in the faith today. Secondly, we need the invention of some new language. It's going to take some new language to speak to some of the people of our time. And looking for that. I mean, we got 24,000 young adults around us at Trinity Church. Reaching those young people is very, very difficult. Trying to find language that communicates, that's only one piece of the issue, of course, but nevertheless, it's an important one. I love the story of Maggie, who was, she was caught in the Burundi War, late 20th century. And this comes from Katangoli's book, The Sacrifice of Africa, I think, page 179. She was working especially with children, and she was trying to find a new word for peace because the Kirundi word for peace was Amahora, A-M-A-H-O-R-A. The problem was that those children heard that word shouted by the people who killed their parents and their relatives. In other words, during that Civil War, people would come up and use a machete or a gun on their parents or other relatives and shout Amahora. Maybe it's Amahora. And she knew that when she established this center for children and others, she could not use that word. So she took on the word Maison Shalom, house of peace. And love made Maggie an inventor. So there were 3 tribes at least, Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa. And so what she did was make those into one word, so that when the children were asked at Maison Shalom whether they were Hutu or Tutsi, they would say, we're Hutsi Twa Congo Zungu. Isn't that wonderful? So they just put them together. We need a new word for life with God. I don't know, the one that I find the most compelling is the word calling. And I use it a lot because I think it speaks to something that I think people sense something in their lives in which they want to be called to something important. Trying to help them identify that, trying to be a part of a community where people do experience calling, not only personally, but corporately. We need to undermine a dominant fluency, the imperialism of categories. One would be those sets of words about, religion that came out of the discourse of the nation state. But I think of racist language, sexist language, classist language, stud culture language, Another word that I think we need to change, and let me not say change. Let me put it this way. I think we need a renewal of the word experience. In a consumer culture, experience becomes a commodity. I don't mean to put this down altogether, but in Arizona, I knew some native folk, and there were times when I was privileged enough to be in their presence when they'd talk about people who would come and have a sweat lodge experience. And some of them provided that experience, but they also thought it was laughable that these folks want to buy a sweat lodge experience. The way that I think we might rethink experience is to think about experience in a trade. You can't buy it. You've got to be an apprentice. You develop experience. Experience is a competence. It's really a range of competences. When I've got to when I got some kind of a problem in a sewer line, if it's something I think I can fix, I get nasty. I cannot keep from getting dirty. What drives me crazy is when my plumber comes, not only does he know how to fix it, he can fix it and stay clean. It drives me crazy. That comes from experience in a craft. Hear what I'm trying to get at there. So to do that, to take people out of categories, to become good at that. One of the things I love about Trinity Church is the way in which that church has worked, and many of the people in the church are LGBTQ, although now we're being told, please use the word queer. Just use that word. And it's one of those words that was a really bad word when I was growing up. But now so many of the folks have said, hey, we're going to take that word and it's going to be our word. We're going to redefine it. We're going to use it differently. And we're going to make it a word that's appropriate and appreciated by us. Okay. So
let me add to that, may I?
Yeah, please.
There were 2 gay guys in my congregation. They've moved on for family reasons, unfortunately. Really neat guys. And they thought of one another as husband, as you know.
Yeah.
That's their culture. And probably 2 years ago, I was invited to dinner at their home. And it was the 2 of them and the minister, a very progressive, scholarly fellow. You've heard me refer to him, and his wife. There were just the five of us there, and I felt privileged. We had a good dinner. We had some snacks and drinks before, and then in the evening we went out to a gazebo. One of the husbands had designed it, the other one had constructed it. That was part of the symbiosis of their relationship.
Yeah.
But as we were sitting there and kicking around theological stuff, in which I was a slow leak in the group, the one I was closest to leaned over to me and says, "You know, you can use the word queer. It's really all right."
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was phenomenally complimented by that.
Yeah.
That he would put it that way. And it said to me how deeply comfortable he was with his sexual orientation and his whole approach to life. And he had done what you're talking about. He, as many of them have taken over that and put a new vision of life in our culture as a result of that.
Yeah.
That little one experience was very changing to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Here, Wendell Berry at this point, he says categorical condemnation. That's one of the worst things you can go through, you know. And he particularly works in this paper. It's in the Christian Century. XNC means Christian Century for me. And he says that what Jesus does to the woman caught in adultery is he took her out of the categories that the crowd had put her in. Our Melissa Robinson, who's a city councilwoman here in Kansas City, and just a wonderfully intelligent human being, I think. She is also part of the Black Healthcare Association. She was talking to us at the Urban Summit, which is an advocacy group here 2 or 3 years ago. And she said, you know, we've changed our language when we work with people who've gone through some tough times. We no longer ask what's wrong with you. Instead, we ask, what happened to you? She says it changes the conversation utterly. So when Hauerwas and Coles talk about performative categories that can open up contact with people, Melissa Robinson, that's an example of that. What happened to you? What went on? You know, what occurred in that sense of performance? And then I like the one that says, to people the minds of the church. Sylvia Wood says you have to tell people things they can see. Those of you who are preachers know how hard it is to try to do that Sunday after Sunday. It drives me crazy. How do you tell people things they can see? The minds of the people of the church need to be filled with actual people so that when we address the powerful captivity of our time, we see people we know are people we could know who are caught in these enslaving conditions. You know, working yesterday with those pastors in Arkansas about cultural traditionalists, you know, if you can help them to see somebody who's put in alien categories, somebody who's really excluded, marginalized, et cetera, if you can make that person somehow very similar to someone in their family, you know, you can make a very real difference, especially when you've got the time as a pastor can have to spend with folks and work that through a certain, you know, through a year or whatever. In this culture, we tend to blame down and we identify up. We need to challenge that, take it on. Our language shapes what we can see. If you use the word welfare queen, you're going to see welfare queens. Well, that's one of the reasons why I like the word wealth fair, which our country engages in a great deal. In other words, subsidizing the rich. We need a language of people that's specific, that's concrete. We need to move down the ladder of abstraction and to speak and move in the linguistic patterns and the practices of a people. Country music is a fun thing to me. I often say that when you're dealing with somebody who's culturally traditional, they don't do analysis, all right? They don't try to break open concepts and look for contradictions in language, and they don't do what a literate person is trained to do. What they rather will respond to is when you can display or show the pain, show the struggle. Let's take an issue like feminism, which I think is very important. If you start analyzing sexism, my experience is you aren't going to get very far with people who are culturally traditional. For that reason, I've always loved Diana Cash's song. I don't know if you know it, but the song is of a woman who spent most of the afternoon getting herself ready to go out with her husband, who's promised to take her somewhere that night. I mean, she's showered and she's fixed her hair. She's shaved her legs. She's got on a nice dress and a pretty pair of shoes, and she is ready to go. And he comes in the door after work and says, "Babe, give me a beer. I'm tired." And he flops down on the couch, and she knows that if he starts drinking beer, flops on that couch, they're not going out. And then she sings the chorus, "Did I shave my legs for this?" All right. I want to tell you, I have never been in a traditional culture setting where that song did not work. Okay. You see what it does? It doesn't analyze it. It just shows you. It tells the story. It displays. By the time she gets to that chorus, you know exactly what she's going through. And then the last one, and then I'm sorry, folks, this took way too long tonight, but this is kind of a long chapter. The other thing I try to do is see if I can put the stories I hear in God's story. In other words, place the stories of the world and God's story as a way of turning those stories around. My favorite illustration of this is a friend of mine named Jimmy Hope. Jimmy Hope's kind of a left-wing type, grew up in Alabama, went off and got a PhD at some East Coast university, all that stuff that you can imagine. His father, very much a cultural traditionalist, probably, well, not only was he a bigot, but at least had that in him, but the racism had him gripped. And one day, Jimmy Hope and his dad are watching TV, and Jesse Jackson comes on the scene. And his father says, "Somebody ought to just shoot that son of a bitch." And Jimmy Hope knows he needs to say something to his daddy. So he says, "Daddy, you really think somebody ought to go shoot Jesse Jackson?" "I do. They just ought to shoot the son of a bitch." "Well, Daddy, I think if you really believe that, you ought to go to church Sunday and pray for somebody to shoot Jesse Jackson." He said, "Are you crazy?" I said, No, Daddy. If you really believe that, you ought to go to church Sunday and pray for somebody to shoot him." And his daddy said, "Boy, Jesus ain't going to put up with that shit." That's putting the world story in God's story. Well, enough. Where do you want to go with this?
Tex,
Yes.
I don't know that we necessarily need a new language, but we need ways to unpack and to help people understand the language that's there. And when people call themselves evangelical, I want to ask them, what does that mean exactly? I mean, that's and I think Dallas has heard me before. I mean, John Wesley's explanation of what salvation is. I mean, these are wonderful, wonderful words, that concepts, ideas that people need to understand. So, I mean, we need to find ways to say them to people so that they can understand them. And that's one of the things. And And people look at me like I'm strange when I frequently I say, Christians are odd people,
Yeah.
AWED, and we need to be odd people. We need to just look around and see the glory of the creation and the wonder of all of that. That's so I think that's, to me, that's my mission in life as I do these things is to help people understand these words that exist currently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I certainly think words can be revitalized. So I don't want to disagree with that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Tex,
Yes.
Dallas. I just feel like I finally grasped something when you talked about calling. And I mean, I've used that word ever since forever as a teenager. But I remember distinctly at Trinity, we were 30 years ago, we were going to go out and we were going to tell people about the gospel. And I thought, what in the world would I say? It just meant nothing to me. But if I have a way and a desire to help people experience their calling, that gives me a whole different orientation. And to me, that's a shift in, I wouldn't use the name gospel, but I would refer to that's what I'm doing. But it didn't communicate at all to me until you said that.
Yeah. Well, I personally find that you can talk about, you may not use that word initially even, but you can talk about calling with just about anybody. It seems. Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
Well, just briefly, I wouldn't necessarily say that, but it gives me an internal motivation.
I understand.
Of what gives me a roadmap, or gives me a calling to do that.
Yeah, that's big. That's big.
Yeah.
You may not notice it, but almost every time we have young adults in church, and we do have them, I will say something about calling, because I'm trying to find the word that reaches, Yeah. Other comments?
Let me chime in if I may, because 40 or so years ago, there was a movie named Alfie.
Yeah.
And the theme song was, "What's it all about, Alfie?" What's it all about?
Yeah.
And to these, I think you said millennials who see themselves in a consumerism context, I want to say, is that really what it's all about?
Is that all there is?
Is there nothing else beyond that? I fight that thought. I fight the idea that it's really the Big Bang and there ain't nothing else there. But so many people seem to accept that. Yeah. What's it all about, Alfie? Yeah. Thank you.
I think that's a good question. Yeah. Others? Did I talk you to death?
A story I remember was in a hospital room where a man had gone in. He had fallen and broke a hip, and the health provider was visiting with him. And one of the first questions was how's your pain? Well, what do you mean, how's my pain? He says, well, the doctor says, on a scale of 1 to 10, how's your pain? And his daughters were so just embarrassed because their dad said, it feels like hell. And the doctor wasn't embarrassed at all. He says, I think that means it's about a 12.
Yeah, yeah.
And, you know, we're so afraid to use terminology that people can understand better than
Yeah.
some of the theological terms that we learned in seminary.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate the long talk tonight. I learned a lot. Very thought-provoking, and inspires me to want to make some changes. So thank you.
Thank you. You did get the outline, didn't you?
Finally,
we did.
yes.
Yeah, we got it today.
Okay, good.
What I found interesting is, from my vantage point, the younger generation seems to be more interested in experience accumulation
Uh-huh.
rather than thing accumulation.
Huh.
They've grown up in an environment where all the things they need in life have been given to them. And they seem to be more interested in what they would consider as unique experiences. And so I find that their level of consumerism is more along consuming various experiences in their life that they can film and share with others and say, oh, here I am, look at me here, look at me there. That type of attitude seems more predominant in what I see in the younger culture today than actually the accumulation that was so prevalent for our generation and the generation behind us. That they're not as much into accumulation of stuff as they are in the accumulation of events that they've attended or places they've gone to or things they've done in a group. So I think that's a positive sign in some ways, if you can focus them into the right levels of experiences.
Leonard Sweet, who's been an important person, I think, in the church here over the last 50 or 60 years, he says that the issue today is not meaning, but experience. And he would be reflecting, I think, something of what you're saying there. And, you know, there are some kids who haven't been given everything. I mean, I don't mean kids, I mean millennials. There's some young adults who haven't been given everything. But even there's a strong experiential piece. And my concern is more when that's turned into a consumer object. And I'm really wanting to see how that can take on the kind of experience that we would describe in a craft. And then, as you'll hear me say later, I really believe that the basic character of freedom is capacity. That the more capacity you have, the more freedom you have. And sometimes stacking up experience won't increase that freedom. But if there's a way that one could use experience and training and practices and the rest, that it really enhances and increases capacity, I think that could be a very useful thing. You know, did we talk about freedom as capacity? Did we talk about that?
Well, we have over the last few years.
Yeah. I talk too much about the fact that when it comes to the piano, my freedom is heavily restricted. I can play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Gene Lowry has enormous, even with dementia, he has enormous capacities with a piano. He can still play jazz pieces on a piano, and he cannot remember what happened 5 minutes ago. So he's got a capaciousness, the freedom of that, to think in freedom that way, I think is important. Janet, you've been looking like you've been breathing to talk, dear.
Okay, back in the 70s, my profession was as a speech and language therapist for 23 years.
Really?
So, back in the 70s, there was a study done called Meaningful Differences. And it was a longitudinal study of children, and it followed them through their elementary school years. And basically what came out of that, just generally speaking, was that the more words that you heard as a child before you went to school, the better your reading capacity would be in school. And then the more vocabulary that you would learn through life.
Wow.
And the differences were based on, they discovered economics.
Yeah.
The poor kids had the lower amount of words spoken to them as children. The more middle class and more wealthy people spoke more words to their children before they went to school.
Yeah.
And therefore learned easier.
Mm-hmm.
And so I read that study years ago and thought, why haven't we used that to address some of the inequality?
Yeah.
I mean, when we can see it, that it went on for years in that study, and that the gap just becomes bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
So when people use their language, they're speaking on different levels of language. They don't all have the same capacity for language.
Yeah.
Let me add to that, if I may. I had not heard of that study, but the part that I have read says that it really does appear that as we develop from conception to birth to year 3, 5, etc., there are windows in which healthy development needs to occur. And if it doesn't fit that window, learning later will always be inhabited. And that speaks so powerfully to me about how we have to reach into these disadvantaged communities and provide the richness for those babies and children if we're help them not grow disadvantaged. Powerful story.
Right.
Janet, if you ever find that research, I'd sure like to read it. I
have the book. I'll find it for you, and I'll
send you the name or yeah, whatever.
It's
photocopy it. Yeah.
Meaningful Differences.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I got that down. Okay.
Yeah, that's the name of the book. It was back in the 70s in Chicago, I think.
Sure. Yeah.
I'll let somebody else talk. I have something to say, but
well, you're trucking now. Why don't you go ahead and say it, and we'll get somebody.
Well, this language thing coming from the South, you know, I know we don't want to get too much into politics, but Trump is a master at speaking the language that a huge number of people want to hear. He is a master at it.
Yes, I think he is.
And other people have got to learn. My question is that, and in ministry, how can a person go, for instance, to the South and do well politically if they can't speak in the idioms? And the same thing with preaching and trying to talk to people. What's so difficult, particularly in Midwest, is you've got people of all different kinds of backgrounds, like at Trinity, and how to use the language that's going to communicate is a very difficult thing. I'm sure you know.
Yeah, it is tough. Others? Well, you think, Dallas, if you go and study oral culture, and I don't know how in the world he got it, but Donald Trump uses basic practices that adhere in oral cultures.
Right.
He talks about heavily etched characters. You know, his language is always filled with struggle, agonism, you know,
Right.
it's very oral. His appeal to the way in which people feel shut out,
Right.
esteem, status, the rest. I mean,
Right.
he's awfully good at that.
Yeah.
There's a whole bunch of stuff there that, in terms of how he fits in an oral culture, what I can't figure out is how a rich kid, given what was it, millions of dollars by his father when he was young, developed that kind of culture. My hunch is he probably hated school.
Well, I just think he's listened to enough records or something that he knows how to do the cadence,
Yeah,
everything.
yeah, he's got it down.
He's got the syntax.
He's got the syntax. Other comments? We got about 8 minutes or so, folks. I just want you to know I watch the time and I will let you go on time. I appreciate you showing up here, by the way. Yeah. Nancy,
Well,
you haven't said a word tonight. You got something? You're muted, dear.
Yes, I think you can hear me now.
Yes.
The reason I haven't said anything is because I'm still thinking about it. But what I do like about the sessions is it's expanding my thought patterns and opening me up to new ideas. And I think that is just always a wonderful thing.
All right.
And so I appreciate that, even though I don't have an opinion one way or the other as to content.
Okay. Well, that's a helpful comment. Thank you. Matt, were you ready? Were you trying to get in? Who was that? Was that you, Matt?
No, my Wi-Fi went down for a second, so that's what happened.
Oh, okay.
Tex, from your experience, is the seminary getting any better at teaching about people, how people can see things rather than do things?
Let me make sure how people can see things. Say a little bit more so I make sure I understand. See things rather than do things.
I'm looking at your number 5, to the people, the minds of the church.
Yeah.
You have to tell people things they can see.
Yeah.
And so is the seminary really helping young preachers be able to tell people things they can see?
Yeah. My hunch is it's a mixed picture. You know, I'm not in classrooms. I'm on the board, but I'm not in classrooms. And so I don't see class. Now, last week I was in a room with Rabbi Zedek, who is just a marvelous gift to the Kansas City community, has been for years. I've known him almost from the time I got here. I sat in his class when he was talking about, he's been teaching a class on Genesis from a rabbi's perspective. And I was very intrigued by the pattern he used with the class that day. Let's see, he was working with that text in the latter part of Genesis. I don't remember the chapter. Was it 28? In which Joseph sees his brothers and is trying to tell them not to be afraid of me and trust, I love you, and you no longer have any worries of that kind. I will take care of you. And the brothers are having all kinds of trouble hearing it, believing it. And then what Zedek did was Zedek engaged that class in such a way that he asked them, each one, how do you see that story? What's going on in the story? And there were, my guess would be there were probably, maybe a dozen people in the class. And it was wonderful because, see, he's been working with them all semester. So we're in the last 3 weeks of semester, I guess, or we were that week. And what was amazing to me was that I think every person in that room came up with a different reading of that text. Now, please, that doesn't answer quite directly what you're asking, but I think it does. It helps what you're asking. That is, by trying to open up that text as widely as possible, people in the room were seeing many, many different, well, at least a dozen different ways to see the text. And of course, Zedek, as a rabbi, has done that kind of interpretive use of the scriptures all his life. I mean, that's what rabbis do. They don't tell you there's one meaning to a text. They tell you, hey, if there's one meaning to a text, God didn't write it. I don't think he used the word right, but I think what he was saying was that it's not God's word. If there's one meaning, it's not God's word. I thought that was just wonderful. So the idea of opening up the text in a good way and opening it up so that there's a great range of ways of reading it, that can enable people, I think, to talk about things that people can see. You know, I think we're always in trouble when we know exactly what the text says. That's what's wrong.
Does he teach at the seminary?
Yes, he's a rabbi in residence this year. So, and I do think the seminary has tried to really work hard on getting a diverse faculty. You know, we've just hired a young African-American guy, got a PhD out at Denver, University of Denver there, did his dissertation on the Black Panthers, but has also worked at Harvard and in other words, several different settings in the United States before coming to St. Paul. I'm really excited about his presence. We're also about to enter a time when we're going to have 5 people retiring. So we're going to have a real turnover in the faculty. Now, we've got some very capable people on the faculty. There's never been a complaint about the academic quality of the faculty at St. Paul. But it's really, and the school is in the best shape financially it's been in 20 years. So it's doing really well. The ATS self-study really was good, very good. And so I guess my answer is I don't really know, but I'm hopeful that there's a sensitivity about the kind of question you ask.
Let me add something to that, because when you mentioned interpretation,
yeah,
I was in a different Zoom session in preparation for Easter, and the minister who led this provided some background information, and it was, one of them was a page that was a photocopy of the text upon which we rely. And what it pointed out is there is no punctuation in that.
Yeah.
There is no capitalization in that.
Yeah.
It's open totally to interpretation.
That's hard for a lot of people to understand, but that's right.
Wow.
Yeah.
If anybody's interested, I'll send you a copy, because it is.
I'd love it.
It's an eye opener for me.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, John.
Yeah, there's mention about punctuation. I don't know. I think maybe everybody knows this, but there's a statement that says, "Woman, comma, without her man is nothing." But then you take that comma and you go, "Woman, without her, comma, man is nothing." So you can see how the scripture can be confused. Human beings are trying to translate it for us. And I'll never forget that. It's just a comma. Don't change any words.
Just change
the whole meaning.
Yeah.
I just wonder if that hasn't happened to us in some of our thinking. And right, my struggle with what you're talking about is, I grew up. I was born in 1937, so I grew up as a young child in Memphis during the war. In Memphis, we had air raids, and we kids would chase the air raid warden around. He had a World War I helmet. You know, we thought it was all a game, because when you're 3, 4, and 5, what we were exposed to, the language then, mom and dad, we of course, George Turkey, I just didn't know it, would invite sailors and soldiers home for Sunday dinner. And we kids looked up to the soldiers quite dramatically. Then comes along my kids and generation and all these guys with long hair. Boy, I go, what the hell is that all about? And I realized what had happened. I was thinking about all those young men, all had short hair. They were soldiers fighting the Hun. And it had affected me. So I, what the heck did it mean? Long hair is nothing, you know, but also I had this in my mind. Now, I don't know that I know how to change that language. My parents still were at odds with the queer community. I haven't used that word myself. I haven't. I don't know. I'll talk to John and Bill and see what they think. But anyway, when my mom called me and said that my friend Gene York that I had gone to school with and we had hunted and had killed himself. Well, I wasn't sure of that because by that time I lived in Arkansas, Jonesboro, Arkansas. I went to high school with him. And I'm not sure that's what happened. But nevertheless, he was dead. And I told Mom, I said, well, you know, he was gay. And he was Church of Christ, I think, which they kind of didn't accept him, you know, in Jonesboro. And my mom was shocked and she says, no, I didn't know he was gay. But the language, you know, that struck Mom, you know, she couldn't deal with that. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if Gene hadn't shot himself, but I wasn't sure of that. That's what the police report said. Yeah, sometimes you never know, you know, because it seemed at odds for me. But he lived in a world alone in 1960 and 70. Well, I'm getting off the subject. My point is, I don't know how to do the language thing. I talk to people that I just can't understand why they can't think that Christ said, come unto me all. And what does the word all mean? And I don't know how to convince them. And neither does the people at our church. So now what's happening? We are dividing, but we don't have the common language any longer.
Well, let's continue to work on that. We've got some resources in terms of language, and next week we'll talk some more in terms of walking the talk or walking the walk, maybe. And let's keep working on it. See what we come up with.
Channel 4, Chapter 4, right?
Chapter 4, yeah.
Yes.
And I'll get an outline to you here pretty soon.